said that he wanted to go to Rome, look at what follows. He says, I must see Rome in verse 21. After having sent into Macedonia two of those who mistreated him, who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Achaia for a while. About that time occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. So usually, after God gives some comfort to his servant, you can almost anticipate something bad is about to happen. God gives you the comfort so that when you're going through the storm, that you're assured that he's going to get you where he said he was going to get you. Look at what happens in verse 12. He gets this great comfort in verse 11 of chapter 23. And then verse 12 it says, and when it was day, verse 11, but on the night immediately following, verse 12, but when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy. After getting the comfort from God that he was going to speak at Rome, now you see the other side. The enemy is always moving to try to thwart what God is trying to do in your life. And sometimes you need to just stop fighting and cease from doing anything. Be still and know that he is God. It says, but when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. You're talking about dedicated. And then listen, we're not going to eat or drink. We're on a total fast until this dude is dead. They said neither eat or drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who had formed this plot. And somebody should be reminded that no weapon that is formed against you shall prosper. If you are in the will of God, listen, there is nothing that the enemy can do that can take you out of his will. He says they came, verse 14, to the chief priest and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Went to the Jewish leaders. It says now in verse 15, therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near that place. So listen, we got a plan. This guy he is getting on our last nerves, and he can't live no more. He's actually said that God told him to go and speak to the Gentiles. And you mean he's telling these folk that they don't have to be Judaizers and they don't have to follow our customs to be saved? He shouldn't die. So this conspiracy unwinds. Verse 15, now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we of our part are ready to slay him before he comes near this place. Verse 16. But the son of Paul's sister. Now let me just pause right there. In verse 16 it starts with a conjunction, but it is a conjunction of contrast. It is a conjunction saying that no matter what the enemy is trying to do, God is always on top of things. Now, up to this point, we don't know much about Paul as far as his family, but this passage lets us know that Paul has a sister. It says the son of Paul's sister, that is Paul's nephew, just happened to be hanging around, and he gets a wind of what is going on. It says, but the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. And look here, I was just chilling out there and I heard it through the grapevine. And these dudes tried to kill you, man. Paul said, say what? That's the KMD translation. This is what you see how good God is. Verse 17. So Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. So take this dude, this young man, take him to the commander, and let him talk to the commander. He says, verse 18, so he took him and led him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you since he has something to tell you. How many know that God will use even you for deliverance for God's servant? Amen? Don't even know this young man's name. He just happened to have been Paul's nephew. Now he's talking to the commander. Verse 19, the commander took him by the hand and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately. I don't know how old this young man was, but he took him by the hand and he began to inquire of him privately, what is it that you have to report to me? Verse 20, and he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. Worldly plots and ungodly conspiracies will not thwart God's promise. God tells Paul that you are going to go to Rome. No matter what the enemy is trying to do, God is going to get you where he says he wants you to go. And so you need to just learn how to trust him. Let people conspire, let the plots come, but you stay focused on what God has called you to do. Amen? Things you should remember in the heat of battle. Number one, the world will pressure you, but God will comfort you. Secondly, worldly plots and ungodly conspiracies will not thwart God's promise. And then lastly, you need to understand that God will provide because he cares. You need to know this morning that God cares for you. Doesn't matter what's going on in your life. You need to know that God cares. I've gone to this verse quite often. Psalm chapter 13. And this psalm is a reminder to me of how real God is and how real we can be to him, especially when we're going through difficult times. I think it's important for us to understand that we can be honest with God with what's going on in our hearts when the storm rain or the winds are raging. He says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? It's important for us to be honest with God. Honest with ourselves about how we're feeling about what's going on in our lives. Listen, sometimes you get angry with God. Anybody in there ever been angry at God? And I know most of us have been taught you don't want to be incredible in light of how David is feeling at this particular time. He's being honest with God, feeling like God is not hearing him. He's feeling like God is not feeling him. And he asks for God to give him a perspective in verses 3 and 4. But in light of all of that, this is where Paul goes in verse 5, but I have trusted in your loving kindness. He says, I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. All of these things are going on in my life. Life is not going the way that I would want it to go, but I am going to trust you. Because I understand that you're sovereign. And all that I am called to do is for your glory. Look at verse 23 of Acts chapter 23. So after this young man is sent away, he says, listen, be quiet about this. This is just between you and me. He sends him away. Verse 23. God will provide because he cares. And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready. I love that. Listen, God is saying, listen, Paul, you're going to get it wrong. Don't worry about it. Just do what I told you to do. So he says, he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. Won't he do it? I remember Paul was about to get beaten. He says, are y'all cool with beating down a Roman citizen? He says, oh, my bad. I didn't know he was a Roman citizen. And then they conspired to kill him. But God sovereignly provides a way of escape for Paul. He says, and he calls these guys at night, and he called to him 2 of the centurions. He said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. And he wrote this letter having this form. So they got all these folk around Paul now. They got this caravan. Paul's in the middle of it. In my mind, I don't know what it looked like, but they probably put him up on something, and he's probably in like a chariot type thing. You just be still. God will make your enemies. God is just so good, isn't he? And he writes this letter. It's the same guy that ordered Paul to be punched in the mouth. Writes a letter having this form, verse 26, Claudius Lysias. To the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Y'all get this? That just went right over me. And he was going to have Paul beat down. Now he's playing the good guy. In this letter, he says, hey, listen, I rescued him. Listen, God sovereignly uses even foolish folk for your service. In verse 28, he says, and wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be an accuser over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Notice the number of eyes you see. But when I was informed that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, and instructing his accusers to bring a charge against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance